My husband stood on the other side of my mahogany front door. A lazy, self-satisfied smirk stretched across his face as he watched his mother Diane kneel on my hardwood floor. She slid a thick manila envelope under the weather stripping. The crisp Vermont morning wind bit at my cheeks as I bent down to pick it up. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper. It was an itemized invoice. The total at the bottom read $90,000. The most expensive charge printed in sharp black ink was $50,000 for Family Brand Association. They were billing me for the distinct privilege of marrying into their local artisan dynasty. Before I explain how I legally dismantled their entire existence, let me know your age and where you are listening from in the comments below. Welcome to Sarah Told Stories. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with entitled in-laws who mistook your patience for weakness. To understand the sheer audacity of this moment, you need to look at the last 48 hours. I packed a small carry-on Sunday morning and drove south for a mandatory corporate risk assessment trip. I serve as a senior auditor for the region's largest agricultural cooperative. My brief absence handed Ethan the exact window he needed. He hired a locksmith, drilled out my custom deadbolts, and moved his 28-year-old sister Fiona into the guest wing of the scenic maple-lined estate I purchased with my own money 5 years ago. Standing on my frost-covered porch, I looked past Ethan's reflection in the glass. I could see Fiona's designer luggage stacked high in my foyer. My new husband crossed his arms over his flannel shirt, tilting his chin up. He mouthed the words, "Pay the toll," through the thick pane of glass. Most brides of 3 weeks would pound their fists against the wood or collapse onto the welcome mat in a puddle of tears. My entire professional existence revolves around identifying threats, isolating vulnerabilities, and neutralizing liabilities. I did not shed a single tear. My gaze drifted past the foyer, mentally mapping the layout of the property. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the basement storage room sat a custom-built smart home security server. I installed it years ago to protect highly sensitive corporate data. It operates independently, silently, recording every breached door and every frame of high-definition video across the estate. Ethan had no idea it existed. He thought he had just locked a naive wife out of her sanctuary. He failed to realize he had just handed a loaded weapon to a forensic auditor. I turned my back on the house, my boots crunching through the fallen autumn leaves. I walked to the end of the driveway, sat on the cold concrete curb, and pulled my phone from my trench coat pocket. I dialed my attorney, Mitchell, I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "I need you to prepare an offshore trust authorization. We are going to war." My phone vibrated against the cold concrete. The sudden buzz startled a pair of sparrows resting in the bare branches of the maple tree above me. I looked down at the glowing screen resting in my palm. A new text message from Ethan illuminated the glass. The notification preview displayed his words with stark, arrogant clarity. "Wire the $90,000 from our wedding fund to my mother's LLC. Let us resolve this little misunderstanding like adults. Fiona needs the guest room. Pay the invoice and you can come back inside. Be grateful we gave you a family discount." I stared at the glowing letters. The sheer audacity of his demand was breathtaking. He was referring to the joint checking account we opened 3 months before the wedding. He called it our wedding fund to make himself feel like an equal partner. In reality, I deposited 99% of the capital into that specific portal to cover the caterers, the florists, and the venue. Ethan contributed a few $100s from his struggling cider business and proudly claimed joint ownership. He assumed that because his name was on the digital ledger, he had unfettered access to my liquid assets. He severely underestimated the woman he married. In the world of corporate risk assessment, we operate on a fundamental principle called anomaly detection. You do not wait for the fire to burn down the building. You look for the faint smell of smoke, and you isolate the room. I smelled the smoke 3 weeks prior to our wedding day. We were sitting at the kitchen island, reviewing our final vendor contracts. Ethan leaned over my shoulder. His eyes did not track the floral arrangements or the catering costs. His gaze lingered entirely on the total available balance displayed in the corner of my banking application. It was a brief, fleeting look, but it contained a chilling, hungry entitlement. He looked at my hard-earned capital, not as a shared safety net, but as a personal bailout fund. The very next morning, I sat in a secure conference room with Mitchell, my attorney. We drafted a highly complex, encrypted offshore trust. I systematically swept my primary liquid assets out of the domestic accounts tethered to my Social Security number. I isolated my wealth in a jurisdiction that required an army of federal litigators to even verify my name. I left the joint checking account open to maintain the illusion of marital trust. I kept just enough cash in it to cover everyday expenses. I knew Ethan would eventually show his true character. I just needed to hand him enough rope to hang himself. Sitting on the curb, I opened my banking application. The biometric scanner read my face and granted me access to the joint portal. I did not type in $90,000. I executed a classic auditing maneuver known as a red herring. It is a deliberate distraction designed to lull a target into a false sense of victory while simultaneously mapping their vulnerabilities. I typed in exactly $5,000. In the memo line, I typed 3 simple words: for the invoice. I pressed send. The digital confirmation flashed green on my screen. I locked my phone and looked back up the long, winding driveway toward my estate. Through the expansive bay window of the formal living room, I watched the scene unfold. Ethan was staring at his smartphone. He suddenly threw his head back and laughed. He turned and showed the screen to Diane. My mother-in-law clapped her hands together, a wide, victorious smile spreading across her face. Charles raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. They were celebrating. They firmly believed their brazen extortion had worked. They thought they had successfully broken my spirit and forced me into submissive compliance. They had no idea that the $5,000 was not a payment. It was a digital tracer bullet. I opened a secondary application on my phone. It was a proprietary forensic auditing software I utilized for tracking supply chain anomalies. The software intercepted the routing data from my outgoing wire transfer. I watched the numbers populate on my screen in real time. The funds traveled from our joint checking account and landed directly in the corporate account registered to Diane's Luxury Bed and Breakfast LLC. But the money did not stop there. The tracing algorithm illuminated a hidden web of automated digital sweeps. The instant my $5,000 hit Diane's business account, it was immediately fractured. $2,000 was automatically routed to a high-interest shadow lender in Boston. $1,500 was swept into a state tax collection portal to cover delinquent property levies. The remainder vanished into an overdraft protection account. I smiled. The financial plumbing of their operation was laid bare before my eyes. Diane's pretentious bed and breakfast was not the thriving high society establishment she bragged about at local town halls. It was a sinking ship drowning in toxic debt. They orchestrated this entire lockout because they were desperate for a massive infusion of unearned cash. They were suffocating under their own financial incompetence. The brief celebration inside my house ended abruptly. Through the window, I saw Ethan staring at his phone again. His triumphant smile faltered. He realized the incoming wire was only $5,000. He wanted the other $85,000. He wanted the full payout his mother demanded. I watched him furiously tap his screen. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was logging into the joint banking portal to manually drain the rest of the funds. My phone chimed with an automated security alert. An unrecognized device was attempting a high-volume transfer from the joint account. I visualized the exact moment the banking dashboard loaded on his screen. I imagined his greedy eyes scanning the top corner for the available balance. He expected to see a 6-figure safety net ready to be transferred to his mother's failing business. Instead, the bold black numbers displayed exactly $42.16. The reaction was instantaneous. The heavy oak front door of my estate swung open with such force it rebounded off the exterior brick wall. Ethan stormed out onto the wraparound porch. The crisp morning air hit him, but he did not seem to feel the cold. His face was a dark mottled red. The smug, arrogant smirk from 10 minutes ago was entirely erased. He looked frantic, desperate, and unhinged. He marched down the porch steps and stomped down the driveway toward me. His fists were clenched at his sides. He stopped a few feet away from the curb, his chest heaving as his breath fogged in the autumn chill. "Where is it?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. "Where is the money?" "Paige, the joint account is empty. What did you do with the wedding funds?" I remained seated on the curb, taking my time. I slowly brushed a stray yellow maple leaf off the hem of my crimson trench coat. I stood up, smoothing the fabric. I looked him dead in the eye, feeling a profound, chilling sense of liberation. The illusion of my marriage was dead. The man standing in front of me was nothing but a hostile liability. "You asked for a partial payment to resolve the misunderstanding," I said, my voice soft and deliberately measured. I sent what I felt the family brand was worth. "Stop playing games," Ethan yelled, taking a threatening step forward. His facade of rugged independence shattered completely. "My mother needs that capital today. We have state tax deadlines, we have vendor payments. You cannot just hide marital assets from your husband. Wire the rest of the money right now, or you are never stepping foot inside this house again." I looked up at the sprawling stone facade of my estate. The slate roof, the custom greenhouse, the heated driveway. It was a beautiful property. It was also a massive financial sinkhole for anyone who did not possess a six-figure income. The monthly property taxes, the winter heating oil, the constant maintenance of the heritage maple trees, it required deep liquid reserves to keep the lights on. I looked back at Ethan. My lips curled into a slow, cold, predatory smile. "Keep the house, Ethan," I replied, stepping around him and walking toward my car. He froze. The sheer confusion on his face was palpable. He expected me to beg for my keys. He expected me to threaten police involvement. He did not expect total surrender. "You cannot afford the heating bill," I said, pulling my car keys from my pocket. "You cannot afford the property taxes. You cannot even afford the landscaping fees. You change the locks on a castle you do not possess the gold to maintain. Enjoy your stay." I opened my car door and slid into the leather driver's seat. Ethan lunged toward the vehicle, placing his hands flat against the driver's side window. He yelled something muffled through the thick glass, demanding I roll it down. I ignored him. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor drowning out his pathetic demands. I shifted into drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I watched my husband standing alone in the driveway, shivering in the cold, realizing he was now a prisoner in a house he could not afford to keep warm. I drove down the winding mountain roads, headed toward a luxury hotel in downtown Burlington. My mind was already calculating the next phase of their destruction. The battle lines were drawn, and I had the high ground. As I merged onto the interstate, my encrypted tablet resting on the passenger seat chimed with a high-priority notification. The screen illuminated, displaying an alert from a popular social media platform. Fiona had just gone live. The drive to Burlington provided a quiet sanctuary. The winding mountain roads gave way to the sleek paved streets of the city center. I pulled my car into the valet lane of a premium downtown hotel overlooking Lake Champlain. A young attendant in a crisp uniform opened my door and handed me a claim ticket. I walked into the sprawling marble lobby and secured the corner penthouse suite for the foreseeable future. The concierge handed me a brass keycard offering a polite, professional smile. I stepped into the private elevator and rode it to the top floor. The suite was immaculate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the dark, churning lake. The space was sterile, quiet, and entirely devoid of the emotional wreckage I had left behind in the mountains. I did not unpack my clothes. I moved the heavy glass coffee table aside and dragged the large oak dining table to the center of the room. I retrieved my encrypted corporate laptop and my personal tablet from my leather satchel. I arranged them side by side, plugging the power cords into the floor outlets. Within 10 minutes, I had transformed the luxury hotel suite into a dedicated tactical command center. A sharp chime echoed from the tablet resting on the polished wood. A push notification illuminated the screen. Fiona had just started a live broadcast on her social media channel. My 28-year-old sister-in-law possessed a deep, unyielding desperation for elite validation. For years, she had chased the quiet old money aesthetic, wearing beige cashmere sweaters and posting curated photos of organic lattes. She craved the status of a rustic Vermont heiress, but her follower count remained pitifully stagnant. She lacked the genuine capital required to fund the lifestyle she so desperately wanted to project. Now she was utilizing my stolen sanctuary to manufacture a fraudulent reality. I tapped the notification, and her face filled my high-resolution screen. Fiona was holding her phone at a high angle, employing a soft focus filter that blurred her features. She stood in the center of my custom chef kitchen. The dark soapstone counters and the reclaimed wood ceiling beams provided the perfect rustic chic backdrop she needed. "Welcome to the new family headquarters, guys," she chirped, her voice echoing with a shrill artificial enthusiasm. "We finally moved into the main estate. I am so excited to show you the upgrades we are planning for the autumn season." My pulse remained a steady 60 beats per minute. I did not feel a sudden surge of blind rage. Instead, my mind shifted into a state of hyper-focused clinical observation. I reached out and tapped the screen record shortcut on my tablet. I also launched a background application that actively captured the video metadata and the live chat logs. I was not going to flag the video for a terms of service violation. I wanted her to broadcast every single second of her unauthorized occupation to the internet. She was gleefully handing me the rope I needed to legally hang her. Fiona spun the camera around, walking gracefully out of the kitchen and into the grand foyer. She pointed out the intricate masonry of the stone fireplace, claiming her father had helped design it. It was a staggering lie. I had commissioned a local artisan to build that fireplace 3 years before I even met Ethan. The digital audience numbers began to climb. Fiona fed on the attention, her confidence inflating with every flashing heart emoji floating across the screen. She walked up the floating oak staircase, her boots clicking loudly against the wood. She turned left at the landing. She was heading directly toward the master suite. My personal domain. She pushed the heavy door open and strolled inside. The camera panned across my unmade king-size bed and the antique Persian rug. Fiona walked straight to my custom-built vanity. She picked up her phone stand and positioned the lens to capture her reflection in my gilded mirror. "I am doing a massive wardrobe overhaul," she announced to her viewers. "The vintage aesthetic is everything right now." Fiona opened the top drawer of my vanity. She reached inside and pulled out a heavy platinum tennis bracelet. My late grandfather had given me that specific piece of jewelry upon my college graduation. The appraised value easily exceeded $15,000. Fiona casually draped the sparkling diamonds over her wrist, admiring the reflection in the mirror. "Look at this gorgeous vintage piece I just inherited," she lied effortlessly. She did not stop there. Fiona turned her attention to a stack of sealed parcels resting on the corner of my vanity. They were personal deliveries I had received the day before my business trip. She picked up a distinct silver package bearing my name on the shipping label. She slid her manicured thumbnail under the adhesive flap and tore the package open right on camera. She pulled out a set of imported botanical serums I had special ordered from Europe. "I cannot wait to try these new products my sponsors just sent me," Fiona squealed, holding the bottles up to the lens. I sat back in my hotel chair, steepling my fingers. The sheer monumental stupidity unfolding on my screen was a gift. Fiona was not just trespassing. She was actively documenting herself committing grand larceny by wearing the stolen platinum bracelet. Furthermore, opening sealed mail addressed to another citizen constitutes a federal offense under postal regulations. She had bypassed a simple civil dispute and sprinted directly into felony territory. I let the recording run for another 20 minutes until she ended the broadcast. I saved the massive video file, encrypting it and uploading the data to 3 separate secure cloud drives. I packaged a neat, tidy evidentiary dossier ready to be handed to the authorities the exact moment I decided to drop the hammer. The bright screen of my cell phone suddenly lit up on the desk. Ethan was calling. I let the device vibrate against the wood, counting the rings. I needed to control the tempo of this interaction. On the 4th ring, I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. I did not speak. "Paige, honey," Ethan began, his tone dripping with a soft, placating warmth. The good cop routine. He was pivoting away from the aggressive extortionist who had stood on the driveway an hour ago. He was attempting to play the reasonable mediator, trapped between 2 warring factions. "I know things got incredibly heated this morning," Ethan continued, letting out a heavy manufactured sigh. "My mother is under a lot of stress with the incoming harvest season. She reacted poorly, and Fiona is just being stubborn about the guest room. But I want you to come home. I want us to fix this." He paused, waiting for me to respond. I remained entirely silent, forcing him to fill the uncomfortable void. I talked to Diane, Ethan finally said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I talked her down. If you just cover half the invoice, we can put this entire ugly mess behind us. $45,000, Paige. A partial installment to show good faith. If you wire those funds right now, I promise I will personally pack Fiona's bags and drive her back to her apartment. We can sleep in our own bed tonight. The psychological manipulation was textbook. He was offering a temporary discount on his own extortion scheme, positioning himself as my savior. He assumed I was sitting in a cheap roadside motel crying over the sudden destruction of my new marriage. He believed the isolation was slowly breaking my resolve. He thought a partial payment would sound like a lifeline to a desperate woman. I needed to feed his delusion. I needed the entire family to feel a false sense of absolute security while I prepared my next strike. I modulated my vocal cords, injecting a slight, wavering tremor into my voice. I softened my posture, leaning into the microphone so I sounded exhausted and defeated. "That is a lot of money, Ethan," I whispered, letting a heavy breath escape my lips. "I do not know if I can move those funds today. The bank puts a hold on large, unverified transfers. I need some time to figure out the logistics. I need to think about it." The silence on the other end of the line was incredibly telling. I could practically hear the triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had taken the bait. He interpreted my hesitation as submissive compliance. "Take the night, Paige," he replied, his tone oozing with condescending victory. "Stay at a nice hotel, clear your head, call the bank in the morning, and we will get this sorted out. I love you." I terminated the call. The digital screen went black. The final psychological cord binding me to the illusion of my husband snapped cleanly. I felt no sorrow. I felt no lingering grief for a future that was never real. The man I married was a parasitic fraud, functioning as a scout for his mother's predatory ambitions. I placed the phone face down on the oak table. The physical estate was secure. Fiona had provided the exact legal ammunition I required to evict them when the time was right. They were trapped in a web of their own making, celebrating a victory they had not won. It was time to shift my crosshairs. Ethan had spent the last 2 years cultivating the persona of a rugged artisanal entrepreneur. He ran a boutique cider brewery that supplied local farm-to-table restaurants. He constantly bragged about his booming sales margins and his deep ties to the Vermont agricultural community. It was the supposed crown jewel of his independent wealth. I pulled my corporate laptop closer. I opened the proprietary auditing software interface I utilized for vetting large-scale supply chain vendors. A blank search bar blinked against the dark screen. I typed Ethan's state business tax identification number into the database and hit enter. The loading icon spun for a fraction of a second before a massive encrypted financial ledger populated my screen. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the raw, unedited data. I was about to dissect his financial soul and find exactly where the rot lived. The blue light of my laptop screen reflected off the dark hotel window. I stared at the cascading rows of data populating my proprietary auditing software. The $5,000 transfer I had initiated as a decoy had done its job perfectly. It acted like a luminescent dye injected straight into the bloodstream of their family finances. I tracked the routing numbers as the capital hit Diane's bed and breakfast ledger and immediately fractured. A significant portion was siphoned outward, bouncing through a local credit union before landing squarely in the primary operating account of Ethan's business. My husband had spent the last 3 years meticulously cultivating a highly specific persona. He wore expensive flannel shirts and drove a restored vintage pickup truck and marketed himself as the rugged pioneer of Vermont artisanal cider. Local magazines praised his rustic charm and dedication to heritage agriculture. I had believed the narrative. I had admired his supposed work ethic. The digital ledger glowing in front of me tore that carefully crafted illusion to shreds. I initiated a deep forensic sweep of his commercial tax identification number. The financial autopsy unspooled across my dual monitors, revealing a staggering level of insolvency. Ethan was not a thriving entrepreneur. He was a sinking ship, taking on water at a terminal velocity. His balance sheets were saturated in red ink. He carried multiple high-interest shadow loans from predatory lenders, operating well outside standard banking regulations. The interest rates alone were crippling. Worse, he had accumulated staggering unpaid agricultural levies with the state revenue department. I scrolled down to the disbursement history, tracing the origin of his deepest debts. The puzzle pieces snapped into place with chilling clarity. Ethan was not just failing at business, he was acting as a fraudulent conduit. He had been securing high-risk commercial capital under the guise of brewery expansion and funneling the cash directly into Diane's failing hospitality LLC. He was draining his own limited resources to finance his mother's desperate need to project an elite country club image to her wealthy peers. The Artisan Cider Company was nothing but a hollow shell, an elaborate front to keep the family facade from crumbling. A cold knot tightened in my chest as the ultimate realization set in. I clicked over to the personal credit inquiry logs attached to his business profile. 6 months ago, his applications for debt restructuring were uniformly rejected. His credit score was abysmal, ruined by missed payments and staggering debt-to-income ratios. 4 months ago, he proposed to me. Ethan did not marry me out of love. He did not vow to share a life with me because he valued my intellect or my partnership. He married my pristine 820 credit rating. He married my unencumbered assets and my high-earning corporate trajectory. He intended to wait a few polite months before manipulating me into co-signing his toxic loans, using my estate as the ultimate collateral to bail out his fabricated empire. I was never a wife to him. I was a targeted asset acquisition. The residual sting of betrayal evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, predatory focus. If my husband wanted to treat our marriage like a ruthless business transaction, I was more than willing to oblige him. I reached for my secondary tablet, tapping into the regional agricultural cooperative network where I held senior authority. Buying out his commercial debt directly through private equity channels would require weeks of tedious due diligence, endless legal reviews, and cumbersome bureaucratic paperwork. I did not have the patience for a prolonged siege. I wanted to execute a swift terminal strike. In the world of corporate risk management, you do not need to own a company to destroy it. You simply need to own the air it breathes. Ethan's brewery relied on a very delicate, hyper-localized supply chain. I pulled up his vendor manifests. He depended on 3 specific heritage apple orchards in the valley for his raw materials. He required a specialized bottling facility in the neighboring county to package his product, and he utilized a single regional logistics fleet equipped with climate-controlled trucks to distribute the cider to high-end restaurants across the state. I opened my email client and began drafting a series of highly lucrative non-disclosure contracts. Operating under the name Obsidian Agri Holdings, my newly minted proxy firm, I reached out to his key suppliers. I did not ask for favors. I utilized the overwhelming financial leverage of my corporate cooperative connections. I offered the orchard owners a premium 30% above market rate to purchase their entire autumn harvest in advance. I included a strict exclusivity clause prohibiting them from selling surplus crop to any secondary buyers. I contacted the owner of the bottling facility, offering a highly profitable long-term retainer to dedicate their entire production line to a new phantom beverage brand I was launching, effectively booking their calendar solid for the next 6 months. Finally, I secured a priority contract with his logistics provider, paying a steep premium to monopolize their climate-controlled fleet for my own cooperative distribution needs. The negotiations took less than 4 hours. Money speaks with undeniable volume in rural economies, and I possessed the liquid capital to outbid a failing cider brewer 10 times over. By the time the sun began to rise over Lake Champlain, casting a pale gray light across my hotel room, the digital signatures were finalized. The supply chain chokehold was executed flawlessly. I closed my laptop, resting my tired eyes. I pictured Ethan walking into his rustic brewery that morning. He would don his expensive leather work boots and his trademark flannel, expecting another day of playing the successful artisan. He would check his inventory logs and find them empty. He would call his orchard suppliers only to be met with polite apologies and firm contract refusals. He would contact his bottling plant and hear that the machines were running at full capacity for an anonymous corporate client. His distribution trucks would simply fail to arrive. In a single night, I had legally severed every vital artery his business required to function. He had no product, no packaging, and no delivery mechanism. The cider brewery was effectively dead. The silence of my hotel suite was broken by the sharp ring of my cell phone. The caller identification displayed Ethan's name. I let it ring twice before answering, ensuring my breathing was calm and my tone was perfectly neutral. Page Ethan sighed, his voice sounding tight and strained. "I thought you might have called the bank by now. Did you secure the rest of the funds for my mother?" "I am still working on the transfers, Ethan," I replied, my voice soft and hesitant. "It is complicated. Is everything all right? You sound stressed." He let out a heavy, frustrated groan, running a hand over the phone receiver. "It is just a nightmare down here at the brewery today. The entire local market is crashing. Every single one of my suppliers is experiencing some kind of unprecedented systemic failure. The orchards are tapped out, the bottling plant is booked, and the transport guys are ignoring my calls. It is a localized downturn. I am bleeding operating capital just keeping the lights on while production is stalled. We need that wedding fund transferred immediately, Paige. The business cannot sustain this kind of random supply chain disruption." The sheer dramatic irony was a potent, intoxicating thrill. He was standing in the center of a burning building, complaining about the sudden heat, entirely oblivious to the fact that his wife was holding the empty gasoline canister. He blamed a random market downturn. He blamed bad luck. He never once suspected that the invisible hand strangling his livelihood belonged to the woman he had locked out of her own home. "I will do my best to expedite the bank clearance, Ethan," I lied smoothly. "Just hold on a little longer." I ended the call, placing the phone back on the desk. The financial noose was pulled taut. With his production halted and his revenue streams instantly vaporized, Ethan and his parents were now trapped in a rapidly shrinking box. The shadow lenders would begin demanding their monthly payments. The state tax authorities would increase their pressure. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. A new alert pinged on my regional auction monitor network. My eyes narrowed as I read the incoming data. With their liquid cash depleted and their business operations choked, Charles had decided to take matters into his own hands. The notification detailed a last-minute high-end estate sale registered in the Green Mountains. They were attempting to quickly liquidate assets to survive the cash flow crisis, but they were not selling their own belongings. The auction manifest listed a pristine collection of heirloom Maplewood furniture, my late grandfather's furniture. The game had just escalated to a physical threat, and it was time to step out of the shadows. The notification on my tablet glowed with undeniable clarity. A local antique dealer within my cooperative network flagged a high-priority consignment listing. Stripped of the liquid cash they desperately needed to float Diane's failing hospitality business, my father-in-law pivoted to outright theft. The digital catalog displayed high-resolution photographs of a pristine, handcrafted maple dining set and a matching credenza. The deep, honey-colored grain was unmistakable. Those pieces belonged to my late grandfather. He spent a decade sourcing the wood from our local forests, carving every joint by hand. They were the very soul of the estate, and Charles was treating them like a garage sale liquidation to cover his wife's overdue caterer invoices. Charles always fancied himself a stoic patriarch of Vermont high society. He wore tweed jackets, smoked imported cigars, and spoke with the measured cadence of a wealthy aristocrat. In truth, he had not earned a paycheck in 15 years. He survived on the fading fumes of Diane's family name and whatever capital Ethan could siphon from my accounts. Now, backed into a corner, he revealed his true nature, a common thief wearing a tweed blazer. I grabbed my keys, leaving the hotel suite and navigating my car up the winding roads toward the Green Mountain Auction House. The venue catered strictly to elite collectors serving complimentary champagne while bidding on historic estates. The autumn air rushing through my car vents smelled sharp and metallic, a perfect match for my mood. I did not drive with erratic haste. I operated with the chilling patience of a predator closing in on a wounded target. During the drive, I contacted the local precinct via my hands-free system, filing an official report for stolen property. By the time my tires crunched against the gravel parking lot of the auction venue, Mitchell had already emailed a devastating cease and desist order to my phone. The parking lot overflowed with luxury sedans and imported sports cars. The local elite gathered inside, eager to bid on rare regional artifacts. I bypassed the grand double doors of the main entrance, avoiding the crowded registration tables. Instead, I walked around the perimeter, slipping through the discreet side entrance reserved for staff and high-end consigners. The narrow hallway smelled of furniture polish and old paper. I walked directly toward the manager's back office. The auction director sat behind a cluttered desk, examining a stack of registration paddles. He looked up, frowning at my unannounced entry. Before he could utter a single word of protest, I placed a thick manila folder directly over his keyboard. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the polished mahogany. I informed him that lot number 42 was currently listed under a fraudulent consignment. I tapped the folder, instructing him to review the contents. The director opened the file. His eyes scanned the original appraisal documents bearing my grandfather's signature. He reviewed the certified property deeds, proving my sole ownership of the estate where the items were housed. Finally, he read the freshly stamped police report, citing Charles for grand larceny. The color drained from the director's face. In the high-stakes world of fine antiques, possessing stolen goods is a death sentence for a firm's reputation. A scandal of this magnitude would cost him his business license and alienate his wealthiest buyers. He stammered an apology, wiping a sudden bead of sweat from his forehead. He reached for his desk phone, calling his floor manager to halt the presentation. I placed my hand over the receiver, pressing the button down to end the call. I told him a quiet cancellation would not suffice. I instructed him to walk onto the stage and explain exactly why the items were pulled. I wanted the truth broadcasted to every single buyer in the room. He swallowed hard, nodding his compliance. I left the office and navigated through the dimly lit service corridor, stepping into the shadowed alcove at the back of the main bidding hall. The room buzzed with the low hum of wealthy patrons, sipping champagne and whispering over their glossy catalogs. In the front row, Charles sat with his legs crossed, projecting an aura of supreme confidence. He adjusted his silk pocket square, chatting amiably with a prominent local judge. He believed he was minutes away from securing a six-figure payout. He envisioned returning to Diane with a thick envelope of cash, saving their fragile empire. The stage lights brightened. The director walked up to the podium, gripping the edge of the wooden stand. He did not possess his usual charismatic auctioneer smile. He looked visibly ill. The chatter in the hall died down, replaced by expectant silence. The director cleared his throat, tapping the microphone. He announced that there would be a sudden alteration to the afternoon schedule. I watched Charles lean forward, a polite, expectant grin on his face. The director stated that Lot 42, featuring the Heritage Maple Collection, was officially withdrawn from the block. A collective murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Charles stood up, his brow furrowing in confusion. He raised his hand, attempting to signal the staff to correct the apparent error. The director locked eyes with Charles and delivered the lethal blow. He spoke directly into the microphone, explaining that the items were pulled due to an active police investigation. He declared the consignment fraudulent, citing the pieces as stolen property illegitimately presented by the seller. The impact was instantaneous. The elite crowd recoiled. The hushed whispers mutated into harsh, judgmental stares. The prominent judge, sitting next to Charles, abruptly stood up and walked away, distancing himself from the toxic fallout. The wealthy socialites Charles had spent decades trying to impress now looked at him as if he were a criminal degenerate. The aristocratic facade he wielded like a shield shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces, right there on the auction floor. His face morphed into a mask of pure, unfiltered humiliation. Charles turned around, searching the crowded room for a friendly face, an ally, or an escape route. His frantic gaze swept over the velvet chairs and the champagne stations until his eyes found the shadowed alcove at the back of the hall. He stopped. His breathing grew shallow. I stepped slightly forward, allowing the ambient light to catch my features. I did not glare or sneer. I maintained a posture of serene, untouchable authority. I locked eyes with my father-in-law. I offered him a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging my direct hand in his destruction. He realized in that agonizing moment that he was not facing a wounded daughter-in-law. He was facing a calculated predator who monitored his every move. The victim they locked out in the cold was now actively hunting them, severing their lifelines one by one. Charles stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a velvet chair. His hands shook as he fumbled for his coat, the laughter and scorn of the room pressing down on him. I turned my back on his disgrace, walking out through the main lobby. I pushed the heavy glass doors open, breathing in the crisp mountain air. I had successfully severed their business revenue and dismantled their social standing. They were cornered, trapped without liquid cash or community support. Desperation drives desperate people to commit unforgivable errors. As I reached my car, I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. I placed my keys in the ignition but paused. A sharp chime echoed from my phone resting in the center console. It was not an email from a vendor or a message from my lawyer. It was a high-priority automated alert from a premium title monitoring service I activated months ago. I opened the notification, reading the stark legal text illuminating the screen. A quitclaim deed had just been filed with the county clerk, transferring the title of my estate directly to Diane's limited liability company. A cold thrill ran through my veins. The fools had just handed me the keys to their federal prison cell. The harsh luminescent glow of my smartphone screen pierced the dim interior of my sedan. I stared at the bold notification banner from the premium title monitoring service. My pulse did not race. Instead, a profound, chilling stillness settled deep within my chest. I tapped the alert, authenticating my identity through the biometric scanner. The application loaded a secured link to the county clerk public registry. A new filing had just populated under my property identification number. A quitclaim deed. My thumb hovered over the download icon. I pressed it, watching the progress bar fill. The document rendered onto my screen in stark, high-contrast black and white. I zoomed in on the granting clause. The legal jargon explicitly transferred the entire sprawling estate, my sanctuary in the Green Mountains, directly into the holding company owned by my mother-in-law. They were attempting to absorb a property worth 7 figures using a flimsy piece of paper. I scrolled down to the execution date. My eyes narrowed. The paperwork was backdated to precisely 1 week before my wedding. The narrative they were attempting to construct was glaringly obvious. They wanted the local courts to believe I had generously gifted my sanctuary to their hospitality brand as a dowry. It was a staggering display of unearned hubris. Then I looked at the bottom of the page. The signature resting on the primary grantor line was a flawless imitation of my own cursive handwriting. The sharp angles and sweeping loops were replicated with an unnerving precision. Someone had spent hours practicing the exact pressure points of my pen strokes, but the true fatal error lay just below that forged ink. A circular, embossed stamp verified the transaction. I zoomed in further, reading the name of the local notary public, Gail Hawthorne. A vivid memory from my wedding reception instantly materialized in my mind. The event had been held at a pristine botanical garden. I remembered standing near the champagne fountain, exhausted from the endless socializing. Diane approached me, gripping a crystal flute. She wore an overly elaborate emerald gown, leaning in close to impart her version of maternal wisdom. She gestured toward an older woman wearing a dated floral pantsuit, laughing loudly near the ice sculpture. "That is Gail," Diane had whispered, her breath carrying the sharp scent of expensive vodka. "She has run the local registry desk for 2 decades. In a small town, you do not need expensive lawyers, Paige. You just need loyal friends who know how to expedite the paperwork." The pieces clicked together with devastating mathematical logic. Driven into a desperate corner by the public humiliation at the antique auction, Charles and Diane had crossed a terminal boundary. They escalated a bitter family dispute into a categorical federal crime. Transferring a fraudulent property deed is not a simple misdemeanor. It triggers a cascade of severe legal consequences. By forging my signature, they committed aggravated identity theft. By uploading that fabricated document into a digitized county database, communicating the transfer across state servers, they triggered federal wire fraud statutes. They actually believed a corrupt small-town favor could bypass the rigid architecture of modern real estate law. They thought they had found a clever loophole to secure a permanent roof over their heads. I placed my phone on the passenger seat. I shifted my vehicle into drive and pulled out of the auction house parking lot. The winding mountain roads rushed past my windows, bathed in the fading amber light of the autumn sunset. I did not drive back to the estate. I headed straight for my hotel suite in Burlington. The upcoming phase required a sterile environment and an uninterrupted internet connection. Upon entering my suite, I bypassed the luxury amenities and went straight to the heavy oak dining table. I opened my encrypted corporate laptop, initiating a secure virtual private network. As a risk assessor, I understood that paper trails were the ultimate ammunition in any conflict. I accessed the county clerk portal through a backdoor developer terminal mapping the exact digital footprint of the forged filing. I ran a metadata extraction script on the uploaded PDF. Criminals often overlook the invisible data embedded within digital files. The extraction yielded a treasure trove of irrefutable evidence. I secured the exact originating Internet Protocol address. It matched the router located inside my stolen estate. I captured the precise timestamp, proving the document was created and uploaded just 2 hours ago, entirely exposing the backdated lie. I isolated the digital signature of the scanning device, linking it directly to the printer model sitting in Diane's home office. I compiled every shred of this data into a heavily encrypted folder. It was an impenetrable dossier ready to be handed directly to a federal prosecutor. I possessed the exact coordinates of their impending ruin. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my attorney. Mitchell answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and urgent. "Paige," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "my office just received a flag from the registry. A quick claim deed was processed under your parcel number. I am drawing up an emergency injunction right now. We can freeze the title transfer and have a judge nullify this forgery by tomorrow morning. I already drafted a motion to compel a police investigation." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the dark expanse of the lake below. The city lights reflected on the churning water, mirroring the quiet storm brewing in my own mind. "Halt the injunction, Mitchell," I instructed, my voice low and terrifyingly calm. "Do not block the transfer." A heavy pause echoed through the receiver. "Paige, that is your primary residence. If we let this paperwork settle, they will legally hold the title. They could attempt to leverage the equity. They could try to secure loans against the land." "That is exactly what I want them to do," I replied, tracing a slow circle against the cold window pane. I explained the psychological strategy. My in-laws were currently suffocating under an insurmountable mountain of debt. Ethan's cider business was crippled. The antique auction had failed miserably. They were starving for liquidity. If we challenged the deed today, they would simply claim it was a misunderstanding and retreat into the shadows. I needed them to feel victorious. I needed them to believe they had successfully conquered me. If they think they own the estate, they will pour every last drop of their dwindling capital into it. I continued detailing the snare. They will pay the outstanding property taxes to avoid suspicion. They will fund the utility bills. They will drain their remaining hidden reserves, trying to maintain their newly stolen castle. Let them bleed their accounts dry. We will spring the trap only when they have nothing left to lose." Mitchell let out a slow exhale, recognizing the sheer lethal efficiency of the plan. "You are handing them enough rope to hang themselves," he murmured. "I am handing them the entire scaffold," I corrected. "Prepare the federal litigation package. Hold it in escrow. I will tell you exactly when to drop the hammer." I terminated the call, setting the phone down on the glass side table. The silence of the hotel suite enveloped me, offering a profound sense of clarity. The chessboard was set, and my opponents had foolishly sacrificed their king for a temporary illusion of safety. I knew exactly what would happen next. Narcissists cannot simply steal a prize and remain quiet. Their fragile egos demand public validation. Now that Diane believed she owned the grand estate, she would need to justify the acquisition to her elite social circle. She would need to rewrite history to ensure no one questioned why I had seemingly abandoned my home. To secure her new unearned status, she would have to destroy my reputation. She would seek to ostracize me from the tight-knit Vermont community, aiming to paint me as the villain of her fabricated narrative. The whispers would start at the seasonal harvest galas and echo through the local farmers markets. She would attempt to strip away my professional credibility, entirely unaware that my influence over the regional agricultural cooperative was vast and deeply entrenched. She was preparing to launch a smear campaign against a woman who held the power to cut off the very food supply her bed and breakfast required to survive. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, savoring the cool effervescence. I welcomed her impending slander. It would only provide me with the perfect justification to systematically dismantle her remaining livelihood. The vibrant transition of the Vermont foliage signaled the arrival of the most lucrative economic window of the entire year. The dense forests coating the Green Mountains morphed into brilliant shades of amber and crimson, drawing tens of thousands of affluent tourists from across the eastern seaboard. In our localized economy, this narrow seasonal window dictates survival. For boutique hospitality ventures, the autumn leaf-peering season provides the revenue required to survive the bitter, stagnant winters. My mother-in-law operated her luxury bed and breakfast squarely within this high-stakes ecosystem. She charged exorbitant nightly rates, promising her wealthy guests an authentic, curated artisan experience featuring locally sourced heritage meals and exclusive farm-to-table amenities. She believed her newly stolen real estate provided the perfect foundation to elevate her social status. With the forged quitclaim deed safely filed, Diane felt untouchable. But narcissists rarely possess the discipline to enjoy their ill-gotten gains in silence. They require an audience. They crave public validation to legitimize their deceit. Sitting in my hotel suite overlooking the churning, dark waters of the lake, I received a text message from Hannah, a junior field inspector I mentored at the agricultural cooperative. Hannah requested a brief phone call regarding some unusual chatter circulating among our regional vendors. I dialed her number and listened as the young woman hesitantly relayed the poison my mother-in-law was actively spreading. Diane had spent her weekend attending various seasonal harvest galas, draped in her expensive shawls, holding court near the cider-tasting booths. She utilized these gatherings to launch a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign against my character. She told the local orchard owners and dairy farmers that I had suffered a severe psychological break. She spun a fabricated tale, claiming I was a financial parasite who married her son merely to siphon the profits from his booming cider business. According to Diane, my sudden departure from the estate was not an eviction, but a voluntary retreat to a psychiatric facility after I graciously surrendered the property deed to her limited liability company to cover my supposed debts. The goal was transparent. Diane intended to entirely ostracize me from the tight-knit community, ensuring that if I ever attempted to reclaim my narrative, no one in the region would believe a word I said. In a small town driven by word-of-mouth reputation, is the ultimate currency. She sought to bankrupt my credibility before the truth could ever surface. I thanked Hannah for her transparency and ended the call. I did not throw my phone. I did not feel a sudden rush of indignant fury. Instead, I felt a profound, icy calm settle over my senses. I opened my encrypted laptop, the bright screen illuminating the quiet hotel room. Diane fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. She was fighting a social war, using gossip and whispered rumors. I was a corporate risk assessor. I fought using regulatory compliance, supply chain logistics, and devastating economic leverage. As a senior executive for the region's largest agricultural cooperative, my signature dictated the distribution of millions of dollars in organic farming contracts. The cooperative served as the primary financial artery for the state. If a farm or artisanal vendor lost our backing, they lost access to the interstate grocery networks and the lucrative seasonal subsidies. I held the keys to their survival. Diane's bed and breakfast relied on a fragile, hyper-specific web of these exact local suppliers. Her elite guests demanded fresh, pasture-raised eggs, handcrafted cheeses, and organic linens cleaned by certified eco-friendly facilities. She sold the illusion of rustic Vermont luxury, and she depended entirely on my cooperative members to deliver the props. I opened the regulatory database and pulled up the active vendor manifests. I isolated the primary caterer, the Heritage Dairy Farm, and the organic bakery that supplied Diane's hospitality business. I initiated a series of unannounced, strict compliance audits. In the corporate risk sector, an audit is rarely about finding a glaring disaster. It is about applying enough microscopic pressure to expose minor structural cracks. I dispatched my most rigorous field inspectors to the targeted facilities the very next morning. They arrived with clipboards and federal guideline checklists demanding immediate access to production logs, temperature controls, and sanitation records. The results were precisely what I anticipated. No agricultural facility operates with flawless perfection under a surprise inspection. The inspectors documented minor but legally actionable infractions. The dairy farm possessed a refrigeration log missing 2 consecutive signatures. The catering company utilized a transport van that lacked the proper updated cross-contamination barriers. The organic bakery failed to properly separate a new shipment of unverified raw grain. I sat at the oak dining table in my suite, drafting the official cooperative response. I did not revoke their lucrative contracts. That would be an undisciplined waste of valuable regional resources. Instead, I issued formal probationary warnings. I sent certified digital letters to the owners of the bakery, the dairy farm, and the catering company outlining their infractions. I included a strict remediation clause. To maintain their multi-million-dollar cooperative standing and avoid a permanent suspension, they were required to immediately sever all distribution ties with any high-risk secondary hospitality accounts. I attached an addendum to the emails listing local businesses currently flagged by our legal department for pending tax irregularities. Diane's Bed and Breakfast Limited Liability Company sat at the very top of that list. The vendor reaction was instantaneous and ruthless. When faced with the choice between losing their primary livelihood or dropping a single boutique inn, the decision required zero hesitation. Over the course of 48 hours, my mother-in-law experienced a systemic operational collapse. The peak foliage weekend was approaching. Her bed and breakfast was fully booked with affluent guests paying $1,000 a night, expecting gourmet breakfasts and catered evening receptions. On Thursday morning, Diane's phone began to ring. The organic bakery called to abruptly cancel her daily pastry deliveries, citing unforeseen logistical challenges. An hour later, the Heritage Dairy Farm sent a terse email terminating their cheese supply contract, effective immediately. By the afternoon, her primary caterer, the cornerstone of her upscale dining experience, formally withdrew their services, refusing to elaborate on their sudden departure. I monitored the digital cancellation receipts flowing through the cooperative database, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Diane was suddenly commanding a luxury ship with an empty cargo hold. She had a house full of demanding, wealthy tourists and absolutely nothing to feed them but generic supermarket supplies. If she served them mass-produced bread and processed eggs, her pristine online reviews would plummet, devastating her future bookings. The panic inside the bed and breakfast must have been palpable. Diane scrambled, dialing every alternative artisan vendor in the county, desperately seeking last-minute replacements. But rural networks communicate with astonishing speed. The local vendors spoke to one another. The orchard owners, the cheesemongers, and the bakers quickly connected the dots. They realized that doing business with Diane's limited liability company somehow triggered the terrifying scrutiny of the cooperative risk department. The community recognized the invisible hand pulling the strings. They understood the sheer, terrifying power I wielded from the shadows. The vicious rumors Diane had planted at the harvest galas stopped immediately. The whispered gossip evaporated, replaced by a wary, respectful silence regarding my name. No one dared to repeat the lie that I was a mentally unstable parasite, when I clearly possessed the corporate authority to bankrupt their farms with a single keystroke. Diane was instantly isolated. She became a pariah in her own toxic ecosystem. The local vendors refused her calls. The delivery trucks bypassed her winding driveway. She was left starving for resources, trapped in the very estate she had fraudulently acquired. The social elevation she craved mutated into a humiliating public quarantine. The ripple effect of the supply chain chokehold extended directly to her son. Ethan watched his mother weeping in the empty commercial kitchen of her inn, surrounded by canceled contracts and ringing phones from furious guests. He recognized the distinct clinical precision of the attack. He knew his mother lacked the intellect to comprehend the regulatory strike, but Ethan understood corporate mechanics just enough to realize I was systematically dismantling their revenue streams. His artisanal cider brewery was already paralyzed, and now his mother's hospitality brand was crippled. The illusion of his rugged independence was shattered, leaving a desperate, cornered man. Ethan realized that as long as I held my position as a senior executive, I would continue to wield an insurmountable advantage. My professional credibility was the weapon tearing his family apart. Sitting in the darkness of his mother's failing inn, Ethan made a catastrophic miscalculation. He decided the only way to stop the bleeding was to strip away my professional identity. He opened his laptop, intending to launch a direct assault on my career, preparing a fabricated story meant to reach the highest level of my cooperative hierarchy. He thought he could outmaneuver a risk assessor in a corporate arena, entirely unaware that he was stepping onto a battlefield I had already mined with explosives. Ethan sat in the dim light of his mother's commercial kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of empty refrigerators. He opened his laptop with trembling fingers, fueled by a potent cocktail of desperation and bruised pride. He believed he had uncovered the ultimate strategy to neutralize my leverage. In his mind, stripping away my professional identity would leave me destitute and force me to surrender the estate to his family. He created a fictitious email address posing as an anonymous, disgruntled agricultural vendor. He spent an hour drafting a sprawling, venomous message filled with severe accusations. He claimed I was engaged in widespread corporate espionage, accepting illegal kickbacks and embezzling cooperative funds to finance a lavish personal lifestyle. He attached a list of fabricated dates and phantom meetings. He hit send, directing the digital poison straight to the inbox of Vincent, the chief executive officer of my agricultural cooperative. Ethan closed his laptop, offering a smug smile to the empty room. He truly thought he had just dropped a nuclear weapon on my career. He failed to comprehend the foundational bedrock of my professional existence. My phone buzzed early the next morning while I was reviewing seasonal harvest yields in my hotel suite. The caller identification displayed Vincent's private number. I answered immediately. Vincent did not sound alarmed. He asked if I had time to join him for a mid-morning coffee at a quiet artisan cafe near the corporate headquarters. I agreed, grabbing my wool coat and heading out into the brisk autumn air. When I arrived at the cafe, the rich scent of roasted espresso beans and warm pastries filled the space. Vincent sat in a corner booth wearing a tailored navy suit, holding a steaming porcelain cup. We had worked together for a decade. Our relationship was not just a standard dynamic between an executive and a subordinate. It was an unbreakable alliance forged in the fires of a brutal corporate war. As I slid into the leather booth, my mind briefly drifted back to my very first year as a junior risk assessor. At that time, the cooperative was hemorrhaging capital. A deep-rooted logistics syndicate controlled the regional freight lines, skimming millions off the top through inflated shipping manifests and phantom fuel surcharges. Previous auditors had looked the other way, terrified of the physical intimidation tactics employed by the corrupt union bosses. I refused to look away. I spent 3 grueling months mapping their illicit routes, cross-referencing weight station logs with satellite tracking data. I gathered a mountain of undeniable ledgers. When the syndicate leaders sat across the boardroom table threatening to blacklist our farms, I did not blink. I slid the evidence across the wood and informed them the federal authorities were waiting in the lobby. I dismantled their entire operation in a single afternoon, saving the cooperative $8 million. Vincent watched me slice through their lies with surgical precision. I earned his absolute, unyielding trust that day. You do not sever a bond like that with a poorly written email. Vincent smiled as I sat down. He did not offer small talk. He simply slid his sleek silver tablet across the polished wooden table. I looked down at the screen. It displayed the email Ethan had sent the night before. I read the rambling accusations of espionage and embezzlement, noting the erratic capitalization and desperate tone. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, looking back up at my boss. I assumed you might want to see the latest attempt on your life, Vincent said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. The author claims you are running a black market cider cartel out of your hotel room. It is a fascinating read. I chuckled, shaking my head as I pushed the tablet back to him. The sheer incompetence is staggering, I replied. My husband has always possessed a profound imagination, but his execution lacks basic structural logic. Vincent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He asked how I wanted to handle the nuisance. He offered to have the corporate security team bury the message and ignore the sender. I declined the offer. I explained that ignoring a hostile strike only emboldens the attacker. I needed to respond with a force so overwhelming it would permanently eradicate his desire to ever challenge me again. I forwarded the email headers directly to my personal cybersecurity contact operating out of Boston. I requested a deep dive into the routing data and the originating source. By the time Vincent and I finished our coffee and parted ways, the ping returned to my phone. The results were almost too easy. Ethan did not use a virtual private network. He did not bounce his signal through a proxy server. He sent the defamatory email using his standard wireless connection. The Internet Protocol address matched the unique residential node registered to the router sitting in the basement of my stolen Green Mountain estate. He had effectively left his digital fingerprint on the weapon. I returned to my hotel suite and initiated a conference call with the retained litigators representing the cooperative. Because Ethan had directly threatened the integrity of my position within the firm, the corporate legal division was authorized to intervene. I provided them with the traced Internet Protocol data, the false allegations, and the timeline of his failing cider business. The lead litigator drafted a devastating civil suit before the sun went down. The document outlined charges of defamation per se and tortious interference with a lucrative business contract. In the realm of civil law, tortious interference occurs when an outside party intentionally disrupts a valid professional relationship, causing quantifiable economic harm. The lawsuit sought severe compensatory damages for the attempt to ruin my reputation, along with punitive damages designed to legally bankrupt the offender. The total requested compensation exceeded $700,000. Ethan thought he was engaging in a petty domestic dispute. He had no idea he had just provoked the legal wrath of a billion-dollar agricultural conglomerate. The process server arrived at the bed and breakfast the following afternoon. He wore a plain gray jacket carrying a thick stack of certified legal papers. He knocked on the heavy wooden doors, interrupting Diane and Charles as they frantically tried to secure a new bread supplier. Ethan answered the door looking exhausted. The process server handed him the dense packet, confirmed his identity, and walked away without uttering a single word. I monitored the real-time delivery confirmation on my tablet. I envisioned Ethan standing in the foyer peeling back the adhesive seal. I pictured his eyes scanning the bold black lettering at the top of the complaint. He would read the astronomical financial damages demanded by the corporate attorneys. He would realize the lawsuit legally bound his future earnings, garnishing any potential revenue he might ever generate. He could not afford a defense attorney. He lacked the capital to secure a basic legal consultation. He was facing an automatic default judgment that would follow him to his grave. The psychological pressure inside the stolen estate reached a boiling point. The air grew thick with unspoken resentment and mounting terror. Ethan crumbled under the weight of the litigation, retreating into a silent, panicked state. His mother paced the floors, realizing her hospitality business was dead, and her son was facing insurmountable civil debt. The reality of their impending ruin began to fracture their unified front. But desperate animals do not always surrender when cornered. Sometimes the sheer terror forces them to lash out at the nearest available target. The escalating financial and legal assaults I unleashed were invisible, abstract concepts to Fiona. My sister-in-law did not understand corporate litigation or supply chain logistics. She only understood the tangible, physical world around her. She watched her brother collapse and her parents panic. The tension pushed her fragile, entitled mind to a breaking point. Fiona decided she needed to inflict tangible, emotional pain. She needed to break something I loved. She looked out the back window of the estate, her eyes locking onto the structure sitting near the edge of the maple forest. She was about to make the most catastrophic physical mistake of her life, setting the stage for a brutal, unyielding retaliation. The walls were closing in on the stolen property. Ethan was buried under the weight of corporate litigation, unable to secure legal counsel. Diane was starving for catering supplies, her hospitality business bleeding revenue with every canceled reservation. Fiona, the failed influencer, felt the atmospheric pressure crushing her manufactured reality. She lacked the intellect to fight a legal battle, so she resorted to primal destruction. She wanted to inflict tangible pain in the physical world, aiming her frustration at the living embodiment of my heritage. A freestanding climate-controlled sanctuary sat near the edge of the maple forest on my estate. I designed the greenhouse myself, laying the foundation stone by stone. Inside rested a collection of rare heirloom orchids, propagated from cuttings my late grandfather nurtured decades ago. The delicate flowers required precise humidity and unwavering patience. They represented my lineage and the quiet resilience required to thrive in a harsh environment. They were the very soul of my property. My tablet chimed late in the evening. A silent proximity sensor triggered an alert from the discreet security server I installed beneath the basement floorboards. I tapped the notification, bringing the live infrared feed onto my hotel monitor. The high-definition camera captured the dark lawn bathed in a crisp, monochromatic glow. A figure marched across the frosted grass. Fiona. She dragged a heavy aluminum baseball bat behind her, leaving a dark trail through the autumn frost. She approached the glass sanctuary. I watched the screen as she raised the bat and swung. The heavy metal connected with the reinforced panes. The glass fractured, webbed, and gave way, spilling onto the damp earth. Fiona stepped inside the structure, swinging with unhinged entitlement. She swept the bat across the cultivation tables. Terracotta pots shattered against the stone floor. The heirloom orchids my grandfather spent his life cultivating were trampled under her designer boots. She tore down the irrigation lines and smashed the climate sensors. It was a spectacular display of primitive rage. After destroying the sanctuary, Fiona pulled out her smartphone. She switched on the camera light and angled the lens to frame her distressed face against the ruined backdrop. I toggled over to her social media channel, watching the live broadcast initiate. Fiona held her hand over her mouth, feigning tears. She told her digital audience that a rogue black bear had wandered down from the Green Mountains and decimated the family greenhouse. She spun a pathetic fictional tale of rural survival, claiming they were terrified inside the main house while the beast tore through the glass. She played the helpless victim perfectly. She had no idea the invisible eye of my server was currently rendering her face in pristine 4K resolution, capturing the aluminum bat resting right beside her feet. The property damage exceeded $25,000, elevating the vandalism from a simple misdemeanor to a severe felony. I compiled the video logs, compressing the files into an impenetrable evidentiary package. I felt a profound, chilling sense of satisfaction. They were no longer just arrogant in-laws, they were fully documented criminals. While the extraction program ran in the background, my mind lingered on the specific psychology of their actions. The extortion, the forged deed, the frantic antique auction. They were moving with a reckless velocity that suggested a ticking clock. Rational people do not risk federal prison for a mere ego boost. There was a catalyst driving their panic. I opened a separate window and logged into the Federal Public Records Terminal. I needed to look closer at the foundation of Diane's hospitality business. As a senior risk assessor, I hold the clearance to query corporate entities flagged for agricultural and hospitality subsidies. I pulled the corporate identification number for her luxury bed and breakfast and ran a deep background query against the National Tax Lien database. The search algorithms hummed, parsing through state and federal filings. A red indicator flashed on the screen. A certified Internal Revenue Service ledger loaded into view. I scanned the rows of dense financial data, reading the outstanding liabilities registered against her limited liability company. Diane had failed to remit payroll taxes and corporate income revenue for 3 consecutive years. She had ignored multiple warnings and penalty assessments. The federal government had officially issued a final notice of intent to levy. Her bank accounts were on the verge of being frozen, her physical assets subject to imminent seizure. I scrolled to the bottom of the page to read the exact figure required to halt the federal collection process. The total outstanding balance, printed in stark black numbers, was exactly $90,000. I leaned back in my chair, the soft glow of the monitor washing over my face. The puzzle snapped together with sickening clarity. The invoice Ethan and Diane slid under my door was not a random number pulled from thin air to punish me. It was an exact ransom demand. The itemized charges for family brand association and social elevation were just arrogant camouflage. They were drowning. Diane was facing imminent federal tax evasion charges. The government was preparing to seize her business and potentially initiate criminal proceedings. They needed exactly $90,000 to keep the mother out of a federal penitentiary. They looked at my savings account and saw a convenient, unsuspecting bailout. They did not marry me to welcome me into an elite, aristocratic lineage. They lured me in as a sacrificial lamb, intending to drain my resources to cover their own criminal debts. The revelation stripped away any remaining illusion of their superiority. They were not old money elites coasting on generational wealth and refined pedigrees. They were a desperate pack of broke, cornered thieves grasping at straws to survive the incoming federal storm. They relied on my presumed compliance to save their fragile existence. The emotional severance inside my chest became absolute. Any lingering fraction of marital grief dissolved into the cold clinical air of the hotel room. I felt nothing for the man I had married. I felt only the mechanical hum of an apex predator locking onto its prey. I saved the federal tax lien documents, placing them directly next to Fiona's vandalism footage and the forged property deed. The dossier was complete. I possessed the leverage to initiate a multi-agency takedown. I was no longer merely defending my assets against entitled relatives. I was handling federal tax evaders. I closed the database and picked up my phone. My thoughts shifted back to the Artisan Cider Brewery. Ethan believed his business was failing due to a random supply chain crisis. His local contracts were severed, his distribution lines choked, his raw materials diverted. He was hemorrhaging capital daily, trying to keep the lights on in an empty facility. He was desperate, searching the horizon for an angel investor to save his sinking operation. He needed a financial miracle to avoid total bankruptcy. It was time to give him exactly what he wanted. It was time to step into the light and hand him a lifeline made of razor wire. I opened my proxy corporate email, preparing to make contact with my estranged husband under the guise of a wealthy Boston private equity firm. The snare was ready to be set, and the hunter was prepared to invite the prey to dinner. The digital clock on my hotel desk displayed a stark white font against the dark screen. I sat in the silent room reviewing the final executed contracts sent over by my attorney. The shadow lenders operating out of Boston had grown exceedingly nervous over the past 48 hours. They monitored their investments with severe scrutiny, and Ethan's sudden inability to source raw materials or distribute his cider had tripped every single risk alarm in their system. They recognized a sinking ship. When my proxy limited liability company, Obsidian Agri Holdings, approached them offering to purchase the distressed commercial debt for pennies on the dollar, they did not hesitate. They eagerly offloaded the toxic paper. I downloaded the transferred ledgers, saving them to my encrypted local drive. The terms of the original loan agreements were predatory and rigid. Ethan had signed away his leverage in a desperate bid to keep his operation afloat. He utilized his brewery equipment, his bottling lines, and his commercial lease as direct collateral. By purchasing the debt portfolio, I bypassed the tedious delays of standard banking bureaucracy. I became his sole creditor. Every single barrel of cider, every copper pipe, and every square inch of his commercial workspace belonged entirely to my firm. My smartphone buzzed against the glass coffee table. The caller identification displayed my husband's name. I let the device vibrate 3 times, taking a slow breath to regulate my pulse. I swiped the green icon and brought the receiver to my ear, maintaining a hushed, neutral tone. "Page," Ethan said. His voice was no longer strained or panicked. The frantic desperation from his previous calls had vanished. In its place, a thick layer of unearned arrogance coated his words. He sounded like a man who believed he had just won the lottery. "I am listening, Ethan," I replied softly, inviting his hubris. "I just wanted to give you an update on that little invoice," he continued, a smug chuckle escaping his lips. "You took too long, Paige. You played games with the wedding fund, and you missed your window to be part of this family. You thought you could squeeze us by withholding capital. You thought I needed your credit score to survive." I stared at the glowing monitor displaying the exact debt portfolio I just purchased from his creditors. "Is that so?" I murmured. "Yeah," Ethan boasted, his tone swelling with fabricated triumph. "You severely underestimated my business acumen. I do not need your money anymore. A private equity group out of Boston just reached out. They are a boutique firm specializing in heritage agriculture. They saw the sheer potential in my brand and bought out my primary commercial loans. They are acting as an angel investor. They wiped the slate clean and gave me a fresh start. We are finalizing the transition paperwork today." The dramatic irony was a heavy, intoxicating presence in the room. He was standing in his empty brewery, surrounded by halted production lines, bragging about his brilliant entrepreneurial rescue. He truly believed an elite group of Boston financiers had recognized his rustic genius and swept in to save his legacy. He had no idea the miraculous angel investor was sitting in a Burlington hotel suite listening to his fragile ego inflate. He was legally tethered to the very woman he tried to extort. "I am glad you found a solution, Ethan," I said, keeping my voice smooth and devoid of any mockery. "It sounds like you have everything under control." I do, he snapped, the facade of the rugged businessman returning in full force. The cider brand is secure. My mother is handling her tax issues. The estate belongs to the family now. You played a weak hand, Paige. We will have my lawyers draft the divorce settlement. You can keep whatever loose change is left in the joint account. Have a nice life. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, placing it neatly on the table. A chilling, profound satisfaction radiated through my chest. He handed me the exact psychological confirmation I required. He felt victorious. He felt untouchable. The higher a target climbs into their own delusion, the more devastating the impact when gravity finally takes hold. I turned my attention back to the legal covenants embedded within his debt portfolio. Commercial shadow loans always contain strict compliance clauses. The most potent tool in the contract was the material adverse change provision. It allows a creditor to instantly recall the entire principal balance if the debtor experiences a sudden, severe disruption in their operational capacity. Because I had systematically choked his supply chain, cutting off his apples, his bottling facility, and his logistics fleet, his business met the exact definition of a material adverse change. I opened a blank legal template and began drafting the formal notice of immediate default. I typed with surgical precision. I outlined the broken supply chain contracts and the halted production logs. I cited the specific contractual clauses that authorized an instant acceleration of his debt. The entire principal plus the exorbitant penalty interest was now due in full. If the funds did not clear the Obsidian Agri Holdings account upon receipt of the notice, the creditor held the legal right to seize all physical collateral and force the entity into involuntary bankruptcy. I reached the bottom of the document and paused at the execution date. I needed to time the delivery of this financial guillotine with flawless accuracy. I pulled up the regional social calendar on my secondary monitor. Diane was hosting her annual autumn gala at the bed and breakfast this coming Saturday. It was the crowning social event of her season. Local politicians, affluent tourists, and prominent regional figures always attended. She charged an astronomical ticket price, utilizing the event to project her aristocratic status and secure advanced bookings for the winter. This year, the gala served a far more desperate purpose. Diane needed the ticket revenue and the elite networking to stave off the Internal Revenue Service. She intended to use the party to court potential investors, hoping to cover the $90,000 federal tax lien resting like an anvil on her neck. The entire family was banking on this single evening to save their fabricated empire. I set the expiration and execution time for the default notice to Saturday at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. It would trigger right in the middle of Diane's welcoming speech. I saved the document, securing it in the master dossier. The snare was now fully constructed, binding every single member of the toxic hierarchy. Diane and Charles were cornered by the forged quitclaim deed and the imminent federal tax evasion charges. Fiona was trapped by the high-definition infrared footage of her felony vandalism in my greenhouse. Ethan was chained to an insurmountable commercial default and total bankruptcy. They were all breathing borrowed air. I closed my laptop and stood up. The tactical planning was complete, but an execution of this magnitude required the proper armor. I grabbed my trench coat and left the hotel suite, taking the elevator down to the busy downtown streets of Burlington. The autumn wind swept off the lake, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold water. I walked down the cobblestone pedestrian marketplace, bypassing the generic retail stores. I sought a highly specific, bespoke boutique known for outfitting the elite political and corporate figures of the state. A brass bell chimed softly as I pushed the heavy glass door open. The interior smelled of raw silk and lavender. A seasoned tailor approached me, offering a polite, measured greeting. I did not browse the racks. I gave her my precise measurements and requested a custom-fitted garment. I needed a dress that projected undeniable authority and commanded the attention of an entire room. The tailor retrieved a stunning floor-length gown crafted from heavy weighted silk. The color was a deep, rich crimson. It was striking, bold, and entirely unapologetic. I stepped into the fitting room and slipped the dress over my shoulders. The fabric contoured perfectly to my frame. The high neckline and long tailored sleeves offered a severe, elegant silhouette. I looked at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman staring back at me did not look like a discarded wife or a victim of extortion. She looked like a judge preparing to deliver a terminal verdict. I purchased the dress in cash, requesting a discreet garment bag. I carried the crimson armor back to my hotel suite, hanging it carefully on the outside of the closet door. The deep red fabric stood in stark contrast to the sterile beige walls of the room. It served as a silent promise of the impending slaughter. I walked over to the dining table and poured a glass of cold mineral water. I looked out the window at the distant silhouette of the Green Mountains. The family was currently sitting inside my stolen house, drinking my wine and celebrating their imagined superiority. They believed they had successfully navigated the storm. They thought the forged deed protected their shelter and the angel investor secured their income. I checked my watch. The gala was merely 48 hours away. But before I could walk onto their stage and publicly dismantle their empire, I needed to reclaim my physical territory. The forged paperwork had granted them a temporary illusion of ownership, but federal law dictates reality. The eviction required a firm, undeniable display of state authority. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to the county sheriff. The final countdown had officially begun, and it was time to clear the trespassers from my land. The crisp Vermont air filtered through the vents of my vehicle as I navigated the familiar winding roads leading to the Green Mountain estate. I did not drive alone. In my rearview mirror, the flashing blue and red lights of a county sheriff cruiser cut through the heavy autumn shadows. A second tactical vehicle followed closely behind, completing my armed escort. The forged quitclaim deed my mother-in-law had filed was a crude attempt at legal theft, but federal judges do not look kindly upon aggravated identity theft. My attorney Mitchell had presented the impenetrable digital dossier to a federal magistrate. The judge issued an immediate injunction, nullifying the fraudulent transfer and granting a forceful eviction mandate. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires as we approached the property line. I parked my sedan near the sprawling maple trees, directly facing the wraparound porch. The two sheriff vehicles pulled up, flanking my car like a tactical barricade. The blinding strobe lights reflected off the large bay windows, illuminating the early evening gloom. On the expansive wooden deck, Ethan and Fiona sat lounging in my custom Adirondack chairs. They were a portrait of unearned luxury. Fiona rested her feet on the cedar railing, scrolling mindlessly on her smartphone, her face illuminated by the screen. Ethan held a crystal goblet filled with an expensive vintage Pinot Noir I had imported from France. He swirled the dark liquid, projecting the false image of an affluent landowner surveying his domain. Their relaxed postures evaporated the instant the heavy doors of the police cruiser swung open. 3 law enforcement officers stepped onto the gravel, their boots crunching loudly in the quiet forest. The lead sheriff, a tall, imposing man with decades of rural law enforcement experience, adjusted his duty belt. He did not look amused by the aristocratic display on the porch. I stepped out of my car. I wore a tailored crimson coat, the deep red fabric contrasting sharply against the muted amber and gold of the surrounding trees. The color mirrored the gown waiting in my hotel suite, signaling the approaching finale. I walked slowly up the stone pathway, standing just behind the sheriff. Ethan lowered his wineglass, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his flannel shirt, attempting to project rugged authority. "Sheriff, what is the meaning of this?" Ethan demanded, his tone laced with false bravado. "We are having a quiet family afternoon. If my estranged wife called you for a domestic dispute, she is wasting your time. We hold the primary deed to this property. My mother filed the transfer last week." The sheriff did not offer a polite greeting. He pulled a thick folded document from his utility vest and marched straight up the wooden steps. He shoved the paperwork directly against Ethan's chest, forcing my husband to grab the papers to keep them from falling to the floorboards. "You hold a forged document containing a fabricated signature," the sheriff stated, his voice rumbling with deep authoritative grit. "A federal judge nullified the quitclaim deed an hour ago. The true legal owner is standing right behind me. Ethan Sanders, you and Fiona Sanders are officially trespassing on private property. You have exactly 2 minutes to vacate the premises before my deputies place you both in handcuffs." Fiona dropped her phone. The device clattered against the wooden deck, bouncing near her designer boots. She stood up, her face draining of color. She looked at the armed deputies and then glared at me, her eyes wide with shock. "You cannot do this!" Fiona shrieked, her shrill voice echoing into the quiet woods. "This is the family headquarters. Half of my wardrobe is inside that house. My expensive camera equipment is sitting on the guest bed. You have to let us pack our things." I stepped onto the first step of the porch, resting my hand on the cedar railing. My voice remained remarkably calm, cutting through her hysterical outburst. "Trespassers do not get packing privileges, Fiona," I said, offering a chillingly polite smile. "You documented yourself wearing my stolen jewelry on a live broadcast. Every item inside that structure is currently secured as evidence in an active grand larceny investigation. If you step foot inside my foyer, the deputies will detain you for felony theft." Ethan stared at the federal injunction, his hands trembling slightly as he read the magistrate's signature. The realization of his sheer vulnerability crashed into his mind. He looked up at me, the rugged artisan facade fracturing to reveal the terrified grifter underneath. "Page, please," Ethan stammered, his voice dropping an octave as panic set in. "You are making a terrible mistake. The Boston investors just saved my brewery. We are going to have liquid capital by the end of the week. We can pay you whatever you want for the house. If you kick us out, we have nowhere to sleep tonight. My parents are busy preparing for the gala. They cannot accommodate us right now." "Your housing logistics are no longer my concern," I replied, smoothing the lapel of my crimson coat. "I handed you an opportunity to walk away quietly, but you chose to forge my name. You chose to smash my greenhouse. You played a dangerous game and you lost the board." The sheriff checked his watch. He gestured to his deputies, who instantly stepped forward, unlatching their steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound hung heavily in the chilling autumn air. "Time is up," the sheriff announced, fixing his stern gaze on the siblings. "Walk to your vehicles now, or you will be transported in the back of mine." Fiona let out a guttural, agonizing sob. The entitled influencer realized her manufactured reality was collapsing into dust. She lunged toward the front door, desperately trying to reach her expensive belongings hidden inside. The nearest deputy intercepted her, swiftly gripping her arm and redirecting her momentum back toward the driveway. Fiona thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities as tears ruined her carefully applied makeup. The deputy easily overpowered her, marching her down the steps with unyielding force. Ethan remained frozen on the porch, the crystal wineglass slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the cedar planks, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the wood. The visual was striking, representing a ruined illusion bleeding out onto the foundation I built. He stared at the broken glass, his chest heaving with erratic, shallow breaths. "Move along, son," the sheriff instructed, resting a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan flinched, shrugging off the officer's touch. He walked down the porch steps, his shoulders hunched in deep humiliation. He did not look at me as he passed. He climbed into his rusted pickup truck, slamming the door shut with a resounding thud. Fiona was already weeping hysterically in the passenger seat, her face buried in her hands. I stood on my porch watching the engine roar to life. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the worn leather. His narcissistic pride was a fragile, easily manipulated instrument. He had just suffered a devastating defeat, but his ego would not allow him to admit failure to his parents. Diane and Charles believed the property was secured. They believed the upcoming autumn gala would save them from the Internal Revenue Service. If Ethan confessed that they were evicted and facing federal forgery charges, his mother would direct her venomous wrath directly onto him. He could not stomach the shame of returning to them empty-handed. I knew exactly what his fractured mind was calculating. Ethan desperately needed a miracle to hide his eviction. He planned to attend his mother's highly publicized gala, relying on the presence of elite politicians and wealthy tourists. He intended to corner local investors using his remaining charm to beg for a financial bailout. He thought he could secure enough capital to hire defense attorneys and salvage his ruined cider business before Diane discovered the truth. He threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel, and sped down the long maple-lined driveway. The sheriff's cruisers followed him, ensuring he crossed the county line without attempting to return. I turned around, picking up my brass key from my coat pocket. I inserted it into the deadbolt, the mechanism turning with a satisfying, heavy click. I pushed the oak door open, stepping back into the quiet sanctuary of my foyer. The scent of my own home washed over me, erasing the lingering traces of their occupation. The foyer was cluttered with Fiona's expensive luggage and scattered shipping boxes. I stepped over the mess, feeling a profound sense of territorial reclamation. The invaders were purged. The perimeter was secure. They were all moving blindly toward the grand event. Diane and Charles were counting on the ticket revenue to escape federal prison. Ethan was counting on the elite crowd to fund his resurrection. They were gathering under one roof, entirely unaware that the stage was perfectly set for their total eradication. I walked up the floating staircase, heading straight for the master suite. The custom-tailored crimson dress waited in my hotel room, but my professional armor was here. The final preparations required intense focus. I needed to synchronize the delivery of the shadow debt, default the tax fraud ledgers, and the vandalism footage to strike precisely at the peak of their celebration. They wanted a family brand association. I was about to give them an unforgettable legacy. The Heritage Inn sat at the pinnacle of a sweeping hill, bathed in the warm glow of hundreds of amber string lights woven through the surrounding forest canopy. Valet attendants rushed to park a steady stream of imported luxury sedans. Inside the grand ballroom, a classical string quartet played a sophisticated symphony, providing an elegant soundtrack for the Vermont elite. The annual Autumn Gala was designed to project an image of untouchable prosperity. Local politicians, wealthy tourists, and prominent regional investors mingled under towering floral arrangements. To the untrained eye, the event was a spectacular triumph. To my trained analytical gaze, it was a beautifully decorated sinking ship. I remained seated in the back of my hired town car, parked discreetly at the edge of the property line. I observed the guests flowing through the grand double doors. I was waiting for the primary targets to position themselves. Diane floated through the crowd, wearing a heavy emerald velvet gown. She clutched a flute of champagne, her knuckles pale from the intense pressure. She cornered a prominent local real estate developer, offering a tight, strained smile. I could read her body language from across the lawn. She leaned in close, speaking rapidly, attempting to charm him into funding a fabricated expansion project. She was drowning. The $90,000 federal tax lien hovered over her neck like a sharpened blade, and she needed a gullible investor to absorb the fatal blow. Charles stood near the polished mahogany bar. The stoic, tweed-wearing patriarch looked distinctly unkempt. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his public humiliation at the antique auction. He held a crystal tumbler filled with dark amber liquid. The ice rattled audibly against the glass, revealing the subtle, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. He drank heavily, trying to numb the terrifying reality that his entire social foundation was fracturing. The heavy oak front doors swung open again. Ethan stepped into the warm light of the foyer. The rugged, artisanal persona he usually projected was nowhere to be found. He wore a dark charcoal suit that looked hastily thrown on. A thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, catching the glow of the chandelier. He had spent the last 2 hours sitting inside his rusted pickup truck, staring at a discount store parking lot, digesting the stark reality of his sudden homelessness. He scanned the crowded ballroom, his eyes darting frantically. He deliberately avoided making eye contact with his mother. His fragile ego could not stomach the shame of confessing his eviction. He needed a miracle to hide his catastrophic failure. He approached a wealthy state senator, plastering a desperate, fragile grin across his face. He extended his hand, hoping to secure a political lifeline, a bailout loan, or any shred of financial mercy. He reeked of profound desperation. The stage was perfectly set. The actors were trapped in their designated roles. I signaled my driver. The sleek black vehicle glided up the circular driveway, stopping directly in front of the main entrance. Timing is the most critical element of psychological warfare. You never arrive early to blend into the background. You arrive precisely when the room reaches its peak complacency. I stepped out of the vehicle, and the crisp autumn wind caught the fabric of my bespoke gown. The crimson silk flowed around my silhouette like liquid armor. The deep, rich color stood in stark defiance to the muted autumn tones worn by the rest of the attendees. It was a garment designed to command unbroken attention. I walked up the stone steps, the sharp click of my heels announcing my arrival. I bypassed the host stand. The young attendant holding the leather-bound guest registry took one look at my expression and shrank back against the wall, dropping her pen. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the grand ballroom. The atmosphere shifted the moment I entered. The lively chatter near the entrance faltered. Heads turned. The visual impact of my presence rippled through the crowd like a swift, undeniable shockwave. I did not look at the elite guests. I kept my posture rigid, my chin level, and my eyes locked onto the raised wooden stage at the far end of the room. As I walked down the center aisle, the cellist in the string quartet noticed the sudden change in the room. His bow faltered against the strings. The elegant symphony fractured, hitting a sour, discordant note before fading into a stunned, confused silence. The abrupt end to the music served as a clarion call. The entire ballroom turned to look at the woman in the crimson dress. Diane stopped speaking mid-sentence. She turned around, searching for the source of the interruption. Her eyes landed on me. The strained smile on her face melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, visceral horror. The emerald velvet gown suddenly looked far too heavy for her shrinking frame. The color drained entirely from her skin, leaving her face a sickly ashen gray. She looked like a woman staring directly at a ghost holding an execution warrant. Across the room, Charles heard the music stop. He turned toward the center aisle. His eyes widened, recognizing the predator he had underestimated. The crystal tumbler slipped from his trembling fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, crashing against the polished hardwood with a sharp, deafening crack. The dark liquor splashed across the pristine baseboards, pooling around his expensive leather shoes. He did not even attempt to clean it up. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of my arrival. Ethan heard the glass shatter. He abandoned his desperate conversation with the state senator and spun around. The terrified grifter saw me gliding toward the main stage, and panic seized his nervous system. He realized instantly that his carefully constructed web of lies was about to be torn apart in front of the very politicians and investors he needed to survive. He rushed across the ballroom floor, shoving past a group of startled tourists. He stepped directly into my path, physically blocking my trajectory toward the stage. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and erratic. "What are you doing here, Paige?" Ethan hissed his voice, dropping to a frantic, venomous whisper. "You have already done enough damage. You took the house, you ruined my supply chain. This is my mother's night. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now before I have you thrown out." I stopped. I stood mere inches from the man who had tried to extort $90,000 from my bank account to cover a criminal debt. He tried to project authority towering over me, but his trembling posture betrayed his profound weakness. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in slightly, the silk of my dress rustling softly in the quiet room. "I am not here to ruin your mother's night, Ethan," I replied, my tone echoing with cold, clinical precision. "I am here to finalize the invoice." I did not wait for him to process the statement. I stepped smoothly to the right, executing a flawless evasion. I bypassed his frozen frame and continued my steady, measured march toward the front of the room. Ethan reached out, attempting to grab my arm, but he grasped only empty air. The elite crowd watched in stunned fascination, parting to clear my path to the wooden steps. I climbed the stairs, ascending onto the main stage. The ambient light caught the crimson fabric, illuminating my figure against the dark velvet curtains. I walked directly to the center of the platform, stopping behind the tall microphone stand. I looked down at the sea of wealthy investors, local politicians, and terrified family members. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Diane stood trembling near the front row, her hands clutching her throat. Charles remained rooted to his spilled drink. Ethan stood isolated in the center aisle, an exposed fraud with nowhere left to hide. The psychological maneuvering was officially over. The traps were sprung. The federal dossiers were loaded. The public execution of their fabricated empire was ready to commence. I raised my right hand and flicked my index finger against the metal grill of the tall microphone stand. A sharp, high-pitched squeal pierced the elegant acoustics of the grand ballroom. The harsh feedback echoed off the vaulted ceilings, causing several wealthy guests in the front row to wince and cover their ears. The ambient chatter, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the subtle whispers of high society died instantly. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating stillness. I leaned forward, adjusting the height of the microphone. I did not yell. I spoke with the measured, unyielding cadence of a senior auditor delivering a terminal financial report. Welcome to the Autumn Gala, I began, my voice carrying effortlessly across the vast space. A beautiful evening dedicated to local enterprise, heritage, and above all, family brand association. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored crimson coat and withdrew a folded sheet of heavy watermarked paper. I held it up under the bright stage lights, ensuring the prominent local politicians and elite investors could see the document clearly. 3 weeks ago, I stood on the porch of the estate I purchased with my own money, I continued, keeping my gaze sweeping across the crowd. My new husband and his parents locked the deadbolts and slid this exact paper under my door. It is an itemized invoice for $90,000. They billed me for the distinct privilege of marrying into their lineage. They demanded payment to maintain their fabricated social elevation. A low murmur of confusion and disgust rippled through the audience. The prominent real estate developer Diane had been trying to charm just moments earlier narrowed his eyes, taking a deliberate step backward. But extortion was merely their opening maneuver, I stated, lowering the invoice and withdrawing a thicker manila folder from my coat. When I refused to fund their illusions, they escalated their strategy. They pivoted directly to felony wire fraud. I pulled out the certified federal documents holding the crisp pages high. The county seals and notary stamps were visible to the front rows. I explained the precise mechanics of their crime. I detailed how Diane and Charles orchestrated a backdated quitclaim deed attempting to transfer the title of my private sanctuary into their hospitality holding company. I named the corrupt local notary they bribed. I outlined the digital footprint exposing how they uploaded a forged signature across state lines. The reaction from the Vermont elite was instantaneous and ruthless. Wealthy individuals despise associating with documented liability. The crowd physically recoiled. The tight circle of affluent tourists and local dignitaries surrounding Diane and Charles parted like water flowing around a toxic spill. Within seconds, my mother-in-law and father-in-law stood entirely isolated in the center of an expanding empty circle on the ballroom floor. Charles stared at the floorboards, his aristocratic facade shattering into dust. Diane gripped her pearl necklace, her chest heaving with erratic, terrified breaths. They were being socially ostracized in real time. I placed the federal documents on the wooden podium and turned my crosshairs directly onto the man standing paralyzed in the center aisle. "But desperation is an inherited trait," I said, my tone dropping to a colder, more predatory register. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small digital remote. I clicked the primary button. The heavy velvet curtains behind me parted with a mechanical hum, revealing a large presentation screen. The ceiling-mounted projector flared to life, casting a brilliant white glow across the stage. I looked down at Ethan. His face was slick with nervous sweat, his eyes wide with impending dread. "You built a rugged, artisanal persona," Ethan I announced, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the room. "You sold this community an image of a thriving heritage cider brewery. Let us examine the actual ledger." I clicked the remote again. Columns of dense red ink illuminated the massive screen. The financial autopsy of his failed business was laid bare for his peers, his competitors, and his potential investors to scrutinize. I walked the audience through his staggering insolvency. I highlighted the massive unpaid agricultural levies, the defaulted state taxes, and the predatory shadow loans he had secretly acquired. I exposed how he funneled that high-interest debt into his mother's failing bed and breakfast to keep this very gala afloat. The room stared at the presentation screen in profound shock. Ethan was not a visionary entrepreneur. He was a bankrupt fraud operating a hollow shell of a company. "You told everyone an elite Boston equity firm stepped in to save your sinking ship," I stated, staring down at his trembling frame. "You bragged that a miraculous angel investor bought out your distressed commercial debt. You failed to perform basic due diligence on your savior, Ethan." I tapped the remote one final time. The red ink vanished, replaced by the stark, minimalist logo of my proxy limited liability company, Obsidian Agri Holdings. The official corporate registration documents populated the screen, listing my name clearly as the sole proprietor and chief executive officer. "I am the Boston investor," I declared, the finality of the statement ringing through the ballroom. "I purchased your toxic paper. I own every single barrel, every copper pipe, and every ounce of your distressed debt. You are entirely bankrupt and legally beholden to the woman you threw out into the cold." The remaining fragments of his fragile ego snapped. Ethan's knees buckled, unable to support the weight of his public eradication. He collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, hitting the ground with a dull, heavy thud. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, as the reality of his ruin swallowed him whole. The artisanal pioneer was reduced to a weeping heap in front of the entire county. Diane could no longer contain her mounting hysteria. She stepped forward, breaking her frozen posture, her voice echoing with a shrill, frantic pitch. "Turn that screen off," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the stage. "Call security right now. Remove this woman from my property. She is a liar. She is trying to destroy our family. Get her out of my inn." I did not step back from the podium. I rested my hands on the wooden edges, offering my mother-in-law a slow, chilling smile. "You cannot call security to remove the rightful property owner, Diane," I replied, my voice slicing cleanly through her hysterical demands. The ballroom fell dead silent once more. Diane stopped screaming, her mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated confusion. I pointed toward the financial ledgers still glowing on the presentation screen. When your son secured those toxic shadow loans to fund your pretentious lifestyle, he required substantial collateral. I explained, breaking down the fatal legal mechanics, he lacked the assets to back the capital. So you allowed him to cross-collateralize the debt using the deed to this very bed and breakfast. Diane shook her head frantically, muttering frantic denials under her breath, but the realization was already taking root in her terrified mind. "Because you linked this estate to his commercial loans, and because he is now in terminal default, this property is no longer yours," I announced, delivering the ultimate killing blow. The grace period expired tonight. As the sole owner of the defaulted debt, my firm has legally seized the collateral. You are standing in my ballroom, Diane. The gala is officially over. The entire family was dismantled. They were stripped of their wealth, their reputation, and their shelter upon the very stage they had built to celebrate their superiority. They stood in the ruins of their own fabricated empire, surrounded by a crowd of former peers who now viewed them as untouchable pariahs. I stepped away from the microphone, leaving the undeniable evidence glowing on the screen behind me. The psychological warfare was concluded, but the true consequences of their actions were waiting just outside the doors. The trap was fully sprung, and the final physical reckoning was about to break through the entrance. I descended the wooden steps of the main stage. The rhythmic click of my heels provided the only sound in the stunned ballroom. The local politicians and wealthy tourists stood frozen in place. I navigated through the parted sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air felt thin and charged with static anticipation. Ethan remained kneeling on the polished hardwood floor, his head bowed in deep humiliation. Diane stared at me, her chest heaving, stripped of her aristocratic armor. I smoothed the fabric of my crimson dress and waited. A deafening crash echoed from the rear of the hall. The heavy oak entrance doors swung inward, hitting the walls with a resounding thud. It was not the local boutique security team Diane had hired for the evening. A coordinated tactical unit poured into the grand foyer. Men and women wearing dark windbreakers bearing the stark yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the State Department of Revenue stepped over the threshold. The radios on their tactical belts crackled, disrupting the quiet elegance of the room. I had engineered the timing with surgical precision. Hours before the gala commenced, my attorney Mitchell delivered the impenetrable digital dossier to the district attorney. The package contained the forged notary timestamps, the infrared footage of the ruined greenhouse, and the shadow ledgers exposing years of unpaid agricultural levies. I requested the execution of the warrants coincide exactly with the peak of this social gathering. The government obliged my request. The federal agents marched down the center aisle. The Vermont elite scrambled out of their path, spilling expensive wine in their haste to distance themselves. Conversations evaporated into tight, anxious breaths. The sheer intimidation of a synchronized federal raid suffocated the remaining ambiance of the bed and breakfast. The lead investigator, a tall man with a stern, unyielding expression, bypassed the catering tables and headed straight for the center of the room. He approached Charles and Diane. Charles stood rigid, his tweed jacket looking suddenly cheap and ragged under the harsh reality of the moment. The investigator presented a folded document identifying himself and announcing the federal warrants. He recited the charges with chilling clarity: felony wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit tax evasion. Charles did not offer a single word of defense. He raised his wrists, surrendering to the cold steel handcuffs clicking into place. His posture crumbled, representing the total collapse of his patriarchal facade. The man who had sneered at me and tried to steal my grandfather's heritage was reduced to a compliant, docile prisoner. Diane, however, could not process the destruction of her reality. She refused to surrender her fabricated status. As a female agent reached for her arms, my mother-in-law lashed out. She swung her hands, letting out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She demanded they unhand her, citing her prominent social standing and her impending real estate developments. She ordered the wealthy guest to intervene, pleading with the state senators she had tried to charm earlier in the evening. No one stepped forward. The politicians looked away, horrified by the spectacle. The agent sidestepped the chaotic swing, smoothly pinning Diane's wrists behind her back. During the brief, frantic struggle, the silk thread of Diane's heavy pearl necklace caught on the agent's tactical vest. The strand snapped. Dozens of iridescent pearls tumbled to the floor. They bounced and scattered across the polished wood, rolling away into the dark corners of the ballroom. It was the perfect physical manifestation of her shattered dignity. The polished spheres of her fake aristocracy were swept away like common debris. Near the grand staircase, Fiona attempted to slip away unnoticed. The former influencer hugged the wall, clutching her designer handbag, trying to reach the side exit. A secondary team of officers intercepted her before she could touch the brass door handle. They informed her of the felony vandalism charges, citing the pristine 4K resolution video currently sitting in a federal evidence locker. Fiona burst into frantic tears. She begged the officers to let her check her phone, claiming she needed to call her followers and explain the misunderstanding. She promised to pay for the broken glass, whining that she was the victim of a stressful family dynamic. The deputies ignored her pathetic pleas, securing her wrists and escorting her back toward the main group. Her desperate need for public validation had finally delivered an audience she could not manipulate or control. The primary focus then shifted to the man still kneeling in the center of the ballroom. Two agents approached Ethan. They hoisted him up by his armpits, forcing him to stand on his own 2 feet. The lead investigator read his specific charges, detailing the systemic tax fraud and the deliberate evasion of state agricultural levies. Ethan did not try to project his rugged artisan persona. He did not boast about his cider empire or his non-existent Boston investors. He wept openly. Thick tears streamed down his flushed cheeks. He choked on his own breath, looking around the room for any sign of pity from the affluent crowd. He searched for a political lifeline, a bailout loan, or a shred of mercy. He found nothing but averted eyes and silent, unblinking condemnation. The community he had tried to exploit now viewed him as a toxic contagion. The agents turned Ethan around to march him toward the exit. His path aligned directly with where I stood. I remained perfectly still in my tailored crimson dress. I did not cross my arms or offer a triumphant smile. I merely watched him. As he passed by, he lifted his tear-streaked face. He looked at me, searching for a lingering trace of the woman he thought he could extort. He searched for the naive wife who would blindly finance his failures and pay an absurd $90,000 invoice. Our eyes locked. I offered him a single, unblinking stare. The cold, mechanical emptiness in my gaze communicated the final verdict. He was a bad investment, and I had successfully liquidated his entire portfolio. He lowered his head, sobbing into his chest, as the officers guided him away. The federal team paraded the entire family down the center aisle. The visual was striking and profound. The elite guests of the Green Mountains watched the procession in dead silence. The local vendors, the wealthy tourists, and the state senators bore witness to the ultimate eradication of a parasitic lineage. The heavy oak doors remained propped open, revealing the flashing red and blue lights of the transport vehicles waiting in the driveway. The cool autumn winds swept through the ballroom, clearing the stagnant air. The execution of my strategy was flawless. The psychological warfare had transitioned seamlessly into tangible legal destruction, leaving me the sole proprietor of the battlefield. 6 months evaporated into the crisp mountain air. The transition from a chaotic battleground to a serene sanctuary required time and calculated focus. The harsh winter thawed into a brief, vibrant spring, leading into the legendary Vermont autumn. I stood on the wraparound porch of my estate, holding a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The dense maple forests blanketing the rolling hills blazed in brilliant shades of gold and deep crimson. A gentle morning breeze swept across the lawn, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. The silence surrounding my property was profound. It was the distinct quiet of total, undisputed ownership. I walked down the wooden steps and strolled across the frost-covered grass, heading toward the edge of the tree line. The shattered glass and ruined terracotta pots from 6 months ago were gone. In their place stood a newly constructed, climate-controlled greenhouse. The steel framework gleamed under the early sun, and the reinforced thermal panes sealed the interior perfectly. Inside the humid sanctuary, rows of rare heirloom orchids bloomed in pristine condition. I had carefully salvaged the viable cuttings my grandfather originally propagated, nursing them back to health. The structure represented a restored lineage. It was a physical manifestation of resilience that no erratic tantrum could ever truly destroy. The justice delivered to my former in-laws operated with a similar, unyielding persistence. The federal government does not forget debts, and they do not negotiate with blatant forgery. The trial proceedings for Charles and Diane were swift and devoid of any lingering prestige. Their expensive defense attorneys abandoned ship the moment the retainer funds dried up, leaving them at the mercy of overwhelmed public defenders. The judge reviewing the forged quitclaim deed and the staggering tax evasion ledgers handed down concurrent federal prison sentences. Charles, the stoic, tweed-wearing patriarch, was relocated to a low-security correctional facility in upstate New York. He spends his days sweeping cafeteria floors stripped of his imported cigars and vintage whiskey. Diane resides in a separate federal camp for women. Her tailored emerald gowns were traded for a standard-issue khaki uniform. The elite country club they once treated like a second home officially revoked their memberships, wiping their names from the donor plaques. They became cautionary tales whispered about at society luncheons. Their fabricated aristocracy dissolved into a permanent, irreversible disgrace. Ethan experienced a different caliber of ruin. The artisan pioneer who tried to extort $90,000 from his wife found himself staring at the crushing reality of court-ordered restitution. With his cider brewery liquidated by my proxy firm to cover his defaulted shadow loans, he lacked any viable income to satisfy the federal tax authorities. The state garnished his future earnings, restricting him to strict, supervised labor parameters. He now works a grueling minimum-wage job at a commercial orchard located 50 miles south of my estate. His shifts begin before dawn in the freezing damp cold. He drags heavy wooden crates across muddy fields, picking bruised apples for a large-scale juice company. He no longer wears expensive flannel to project a rustic brand. He wears a stained, high-visibility safety vest, laboring under the strict oversight of a regional manager who does not care about his fabricated pedigree. His hands are calloused and aching, his entrepreneurial dreams crumbled into dust, replaced by the exhausting, repetitive physical labor he used to outsource. Every paycheck he earns is instantly intercepted by the government, leaving him barely enough capital to rent a tiny, unfurnished room above a noisy auto repair garage. The most exquisite resolution, however, unfolded precisely at the site of their crowning social event. When the dust settled on the criminal indictments, the Federal Revenue Department moved to seize the remaining assets tied to Diane's limited liability company. Because my firm, Obsidian Agri Holdings, held the primary defaulted notes utilized to secure the property, I executed my right to claim the collateral. I legally acquired the luxury bed and breakfast. I did not maintain the property as a pretentious hospitality venue. The region did not need another overpriced inn serving wealthy tourists. The local farming community required tangible infrastructure to survive the shifting economic climate. I leveraged my position within the agricultural cooperative and transformed the sprawling estate into a subsidized training center. We ripped out the imported silk curtains and the crystal chandeliers, replacing them with practical instructional classrooms and certified testing kitchens. The cooperative now uses the facility to teach sustainable farming practices and supply chain management to local organic vendors. The doors Diane used to guard so fiercely are now open to the exact working-class people she despised. Fiona directly contributed to the success of this new agricultural center. During her criminal arraignment for the greenhouse vandalism, her public defender brokered a fragile plea agreement to keep her out of a county jail cell. The judge approved the deal, mandating 500 hours of supervised physical community service. I utilized my corporate influence to ensure she completed those hours under the direct jurisdiction of the cooperative training facility. The failed influencer who once trespassed in my home and mocked my jewelry now reports for duty every weekend at 6 in the morning. She is tasked with the most grueling sanitation duties required to keep the agricultural center operational. She scrubs the industrial kitchen floors, mops the muddy entryways, and manually clears the heavy steaming compost bins located behind the main barn. The pungent smell of rotting apples and damp earth clings to her clothes. Her designer boots are replaced by thick rubber galoshes. Her perfectly manicured hands are rough and blistered, hidden beneath heavy-duty cleaning gloves. She operates without a smartphone, banned from accessing social media by the terms of her probation. She spends her days hauling organic waste across the very same property where her mother used to host elite galas. It is a seamless loop of poetic justice. I turned away from the restored greenhouse and walked back up the stone pathway toward my home. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. I bypassed the formal living room and stepped into my private home office. The space was organized, calm, and filled with the morning light pouring through the bay windows. My encrypted servers hummed quietly in the basement, ensuring the perimeter remained forever secure. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and rested my coffee mug on the polished mahogany desk. I glanced toward the far wall. Hanging between two framed corporate diplomas rested a simple black wooden frame. Inside the glass, secure and perfectly preserved, was the original manila document Diane slid under my door 6 months ago. I read the printed total one last time. $90,000. It served as a daily, silent reminder of the exact moment they sealed their own fate. They assumed a piece of paper and a changed lock would intimidate me into surrendering my capital. They thought they could extract my resources and discard me when my utility expired. They treated me like a naive variable in a sloppy equation. They failed to realize that every action carries an equal reaction in the ledger of life. When people show you their willingness to exploit your kindness, you must never offer them a second chance to strike. You must build a wall they cannot climb and secure the gates. In the world of corporate risk assessment, every threat must be isolated, analyzed, and systematically dismantled until the hazard is entirely neutralized. You do not negotiate with a parasite. You cut off the host supply and watch it wither into nothing. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, tasting the bitter, complex notes. The ledgers were permanently balanced. The liabilities were extinguished. I did not just survive an amateur ambush. I mapped their vulnerabilities, severed their lifelines, and claimed their territory for my own. The estate was quiet, the empire was secure, and the keys resting in my pocket belonged solely to me. There is a profound, almost haunting stillness that follows the collapse of a dynasty. When we look back at the ashes of the fabricated empire orchestrated by Diane and Charles, and the subsequent ruin of their children, Ethan and Fiona, it is easy to fixate purely on the financial execution. The $90,000 invoice framed on a home office wall serves as a brilliant trophy of corporate retribution. Yet, if we look closer, past the forged quitclaim deeds, the frozen bank accounts, and the blinding glow of federal police lights, that framed piece of paper transforms into something far more tragic. It is not merely an extortion demand, it is an itemized receipt for decades of catastrophic parenting. It is a terrifying autopsy of what happens when the traditional family structure is hollowed out, stripped of honesty and fairness, and stuffed entirely with unearned pride. In traditional American culture, the concept of the family unit has long been revered as the ultimate crucible for character development. We are taught that the home is where we learn the fundamental mechanics of the world, that hard work yields genuine reward, that fairness is the bedrock of a functioning society, and that honesty is the only currency that does not depreciate. But there is a dark, insidious underbelly to the American dream of legacy and upward mobility. When parents prioritize social elevation and brand association over the rigorous, often painful work of instilling moral integrity, they do not build a dynasty. They build a fragile glass house on a severe fault line. Diane and Charles believed they were providing their children with an aristocratic shield. They gave Ethan the seed money for a rustic artisanal persona. They gave Fiona the designer luggage and the unearned confidence to walk into spaces she did not own. But in their desperate pursuit of projecting wealth, they entirely neglected to teach their children how to actually generate or sustain it. This lack of foundational grounding breeds a profound deficit in emotional awareness. Emotional intelligence in children is not organically inherited. It is meticulously taught through the observation of consequences. When a child makes a mistake, a healthy family dynamic requires the parents to hold the child's feet to the fire, guiding them through the uncomfortable process of accountability, apology, and restitution. Ethan and Fiona were entirely robbed of this vital developmental milestone. They were raised in a toxic ecosystem where blame was always outsourced and accountability was treated as a symptom of the lower class. When Ethan's cider business began to hemorrhage capital, he did not possess the emotional maturity to ask for help or reassess his business model. His instinct, carefully honed by years of parental enabling, was to find a host to parasitize. He viewed his wife not as a partner deserving of honesty and mutual respect, but as a walking credit score, a designated bailout fund required to subsidize his failures. Fiona, equally crippled by a lack of emotional awareness, equated her self-worth entirely with borrowed aesthetics. When faced with the uncomfortable reality of legal consequences, her mind simply shattered into primal vandalism. Herein lies a truth that aggressively pushes against the grain of modern parenting philosophies. We are constantly told that a parent's ultimate duty is to protect their child from the harshness of the world. We are instructed to pave the roads they walk on, to build impregnable fortresses around their fragile egos, and to give them everything we never had. But this conventional wisdom is a dangerous, slow-acting poison. Unconditional protection breeds conditional morality. Shielding a child from the natural consequences of their own actions is not an act of deep maternal or paternal love. It is the most profound and crippling form of child abuse. By constantly bailing Ethan out of his toxic debt and indulging Fiona's desperate need for unearned validation, Diane and Charles effectively amputated their children's survival instincts. They taught them that the rules of fairness and honesty were flexible, applying only to the people beneath them in the social hierarchy. But the real world is entirely indifferent to a fabricated pedigree. When Ethan and Fiona were finally forced to step out of their parents' artificial greenhouse and into the biting winter of reality, they did not know how to survive. They froze. Their parents had handed them the keys to a kingdom, but never taught them how to fight, how to build, or how to survive a siege. They raised soft, arrogant monarchs who fundamentally believed that the universe owed them a crown, entirely unaware that the peasants were already sharpening the guillotine. Navigating the treacherous waters of raising grounded, empathetic children in a society that increasingly values superficial aesthetics over deep-rooted character is one of the most difficult challenges we face today. It requires an unyielding commitment to truth, even when the truth is deeply uncomfortable. It requires the courage to let our children fail, to let them scrape their knees and face the sobering weight of their own bad decisions, so that they might learn the invaluable mechanics of standing back up. If you have ever watched a family crumble under the toxic weight of its own unearned pride, or if you are fighting the quiet daily battles to instill genuine fairness and emotional awareness in the next generation, you understand that these stories are more than just entertainment. They are roadmaps. They are cautionary tales that echo in the quiet halls of our own homes. Join our community of listeners who crave truth, justice, and the deep psychological unraveling of human nature. Hit that subscribe button and follow Sarah Told Stories as we continue to explore the darkest, most triumphant corners of the human experience. As the dust settles on the broken empire in the Green Mountains, and the cold Vermont wind strips the final dead leaves from the ancient maple trees, we are left to ponder the quiet, haunting legacy of the family we just witnessed. We must look at the framed invoice, the shattered glass, and the empty, foreclosed rooms, and ask ourselves what we are truly building within the walls of our own homes. Are we cultivating resilient, honest individuals, capable of weathering the inevitable storms of life? Or are we meticulously curating a beautiful, hollow facade, destined to shatter the moment the wind changes direction? Perhaps the most terrifying realization is not that monsters lurk in the shadows, but that we might unknowingly be raising them at our own dinner tables. We mold the future with every excuse we make for our children and every consequence we sweep under the rug. In the end, the ultimate measure of a parent's legacy is not the wealth they leave behind, but the character of the people who inherit it. Love that demands no accountability is simply disguised